There were mornings in Paris when the city didn't wake to church bells, but to the slow, groaning wheels of a wooden cart. It creaked over the cobblestones like an omen, carrying a tall, shrouded shape, timber and steel, draped in black cloth, as if it knew to be ashamed of what it was about to do. The people lined the boulevard in silence, not to celebrate a holiday, but to witness a headfall. In that stillness, a sound would rise, soft, metallic, unmistakable. The brush of blade against metal, cold and sharp, like teeth grinding in a winter wind. The guillotine, a machine born in the name of equality, raised on blood and fed by fear. It had no eyes, no mouth, no soul. But for over 2 centuries, it played the leading role in some of France's most tragic performances. People did not call it the machine. They called her La Guillotine. Like a widow in black, she watched quietly, always ready, always hungry. But before she became an icon, she was just an idea, uttered first by a man who never meant for it to become a symbol of terror. His name was Joseph Ignace Guillotine. He didn't invent the device. He was a physician, not an executioner. He believed that death too should be fair, that in a society screaming for liberty, it was unacceptable that nobles should die by sword, clean and swift, while commoners were hanged, burned, or torn limb from limb. So in 1789, at the dawn of the French Revolution, he proposed a simple, radical thought. Let every condemned man die the same way, with his head. The idea was laughed at. Dr. Guillotine wants to democratize death, they said, but revolutions have a way of turning irony into law. In 1792, the first guillotine was erected in the Place de Grève, in the heart of Paris. Its design was simple: 2 tall wooden posts, a heavy triangular blade suspended on a rope. One pull, and the blade would fall, fast enough to outpace any prayer. The first to die beneath it was a petty thief. The crowd cheered. They clapped as his head dropped into the wicker basket like a ripe fruit. From that moment on, Paris woke not to the sun, but to the scent of blood. The guillotine did not choose its victims. It didn't ask questions. It didn't care why. That was precisely its power. It executed with neutrality. Cold, merciless, equal. And as it killed more, people trusted it more. It worked so efficiently, they said, that officials had to move executions from morning to afternoon because there wasn't enough time to clean up the mess. But don't be fooled. The guillotine was no mindless tool. It waited, it listened, and every time someone climbed the steps, it held its breath. Like a predator before the pounce, death had become a ceremony, quick, clean, unforgiving. There was something far more terrifying than blood, the absence of emotion. The guillotine didn't rage. It didn't seek revenge. It simply followed orders. And in a world where people killed for justice, for glory, for belief, the guillotine killed for no reason at all. That's why even those who once wielded it, when it was finally their turn, dared not curse it. Because deep inside, they had once believed in it too. It had many names: the widow, Madame la Guillotine, the national razor, but the one Parisians used most often was la veuve, the widow, because anyone who ascended its platform died alone. Some cried, some prayed, some sang, but all were cut off, mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-fear. There's a story of a young girl condemned for handing out anti-revolutionary pamphlets. As she climbed the steps, her shoe caught on the wood. The executioner gently helped her up. She smiled, her last gesture in this world. 10 seconds later, her head lay in a basket. It was 2:10 in the afternoon. A light wind stirred. A single pigeon passed overhead, then vanished into the gray sky. The guillotine didn't remember, but everyone who stood below it would never forget. One witness wrote in his journal, "I stopped believing in death afterward, because the true death wasn't in the blade. It was in the eyes of those about to die. They didn't look at the sky. They didn't look at the crowd. They looked inward, one last time." But why did this machine become a symbol? Because it killed fairly, or because it killed too much? In just 3 years, more than 16,000 people were executed publicly under its blade. Blood streamed down the wooden platform, soaking into the soil, the stone, the collective memory of a nation. Some mornings, wine cellars set up stalls near the execution grounds. Children played in the square. Adults placed bets on who would be next. The guillotine wasn't just an instrument. It was a ritual, part of daily life. Like the cathedral, like the bakery, like the moon. There were those who resisted. Some thinkers whispered, "Justice is not in the blade. It's in the moment we choose to stop using it." But words don't stop ropes from being pulled. The blade kept falling, steel kept screaming, and death came like a blink, then left behind a silence that stained the air. At the end of each day, the platform was scrubbed. Clothes were burned, blood washed away, but something always lingered, an echo, a chill, a whisper in the stone, that even justice can become a killer. There was a time when the guillotine no longer waited in silence. It sang. Each fall of the blade was a note in a new anthem, composed not with instruments, but with the rhythm of dying. The revolution had found its metronome, and it ticked in steel and screams. In the beginning, it had been about justice, but now it was about purification, about ideals made of flesh and beliefs soaked in blood. The reign of terror had begun. From 1793 to 1794, France bled in public squares. Guillotine became the center of political life, standing tall in the Place de la Révolution, its wooden frame casting a long shadow across the cobblestones. It was no longer just a machine, it was an altar, and every day Paris offered sacrifices. First came the king, Louis XVI, once the divine monarch, now just a man in a simple white shirt. He rode to his execution in a plain carriage, quiet, eyes forward. When he stood on the scaffold, he tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the crowd roared too loudly to hear him. His words were swallowed. The blade wasn't. It fell with a hiss, like breath being sucked from the lungs of a city. And just like that, the crown rolled into a basket, and France had no king. Not long after, his queen followed, Marie Antoinette. The woman, once dressed in silk and pearls, now stood trembling in a threadbare gown, her hair cut short to expose her neck. No powdered wigs, no diamonds, only shame, only silence. They say she stepped lightly, with dignity, but her face was gray, like marble left in the rain. When the blade came for her, there were no cheers, only the creak of wood, the whoosh of falling metal, and the soft, final thud. The queen was gone, and still the machine kept going. Georges Danton, Camille Desmoulins, Charlotte Corday, Robespierre. Names that had once lit fires in revolutionary hearts were now names whispered with fear, because the guillotine devoured not only tyrants, but those who dared to define tyranny. Danton, once a giant of the revolution, laughed on his way to the scaffold. He shouted to the executioner, "Show my head to the people. It's worth seeing." Then he died, eyes open, jaw slack. Corday had stabbed Marat in his bath, claiming she killed a monster to save France. But France didn't want saving. It wanted retribution. Her young body was tied to the board, her face pale and dry as she waited for the blade. Robespierre, once the architect of the terror, was dragged to the guillotine with his jaw shattered, half his face bandaged in blood. The people he had condemned now watched him suffer. He couldn't speak, couldn't plead, could only blink as the blade approached. And the guillotine, it did not pause. Each fall was a cleansing, each death a ritual. To die by the guillotine was to become part of a myth that told the people they were purging corruption, that salvation lay in steel, and that a better world would rise from the severed necks of the old. Children grew up knowing the sound. Bread sellers shaped loaves like little blades. Men and women packed lunches to eat during executions, calling them picnics at the guillotine. It wasn't just a punishment, it was entertainment, a theater. Some arrived hours early to get the best view. They climbed on barrels hung from balconies. Parents lifted their children high so they wouldn't miss the moment when life ended in a red splash and silence. The guillotine gave them what religion once had: mystery, awe, judgment. It had become a god in its own right. And yet, in the hush that followed every execution, something shifted. Some began to notice that the line between justice and spectacle had blurred, vanished even. They whispered in cafes behind closed doors. Why are so many dying? Who's next? Will it be me? The revolution had become a mouth that fed on its own tongue. No one was safe. A woman was executed for weeping during the king's procession. A man was beheaded for naming his bakery the Queen's Oven. One old priest was guillotined because he blessed a dying soldier in Latin. The crowd began to thin. Laughter faded. Picnics turned to murmurs. The scaffold was still there, still thirsty, but now the air was heavy, not with blood, but with doubt. And the guillotine, it never blinked, it never paused. But something had changed. It was no longer the crowd's darling. It was their fear. Even the executioners felt it. Sanson, the chief executioner of Paris, wrote in his journals that some nights after the day's work was done, he would dream of headless bodies walking the streets, silent, searching. He had once taken pride in the clean drop of his blade. Now he began to shake. "It is not death I fear," he wrote, "but the eyes of the dead." By the summer of 1794, the bloodlust had grown tired of itself. People looked away. They stayed indoors. The revolution, once a storm, became a drizzle, gray, bitter, directionless. When Robespierre was guillotined, his body broken, his words silenced, Paris didn't cheer. It exhaled. And for the first time, the guillotine looked lonely. The wood began to crack. The blade dulled slightly. Even the baskets, once replaced weekly, now lasted longer. The goddess of death had grown old, but she wasn't finished, not yet. By the time the revolution had burned itself to ash, the guillotine remained. Not as a symbol anymore, not as justice, but simply as routine. It stood like an aging actor, still dressed for a role long forgotten, waiting for applause that would never come. Paris moved on. The barricades came down. The slogans faded from the walls. Kings returned, empires rose, republics fell. And yet, in the quiet corners of the city, the blade still fell. Not every day, not to roaring crowds, but always with the same deadly precision. Through the 19th century, the guillotine became a whisper, a thing no longer paraded in squares, but hidden behind prison walls. Its scaffold was disassembled, rebuilt, moved in silence from courtyard to courtyard. The blood it spilled was no longer ideological, just criminal, but it was still blood, and the blade still sharp. In 1870, under Napoleon III, public executions briefly returned. Once again, crowds gathered, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no thrill in it now, only discomfort, curiosity mixed with guilt. People came not to cheer, but to see if they could stomach it. They rarely could. In 1939, the last public execution in France took place. The prisoner, Eugène Weidmann, was convicted of murder. He was led into the open courtyard outside the gates of Versailles prison. A small, early morning crowd gathered. Journalists, police, spectators leaning from apartment balconies. The sun had barely risen. The blade fell. And in that moment, someone snapped a photograph. The light of the flash, the sight of the blood, the cheers from a few in the crowd, it horrified the nation. The French government decided quietly that this would be the last. From then on, the guillotine would work only behind closed doors, like a family secret, like a shameful addiction. And so it did. In a hidden room at La Santé prison in Paris, beneath flickering lights, the blade continued its work, metal hissing through silence, dropping onto necks that once belonged to thieves, murderers, even poets. One executioner described the sound of it not as a crash, but a sigh. "It falls like someone giving up," he wrote. Between 1939 and 1977, 22 men were guillotined in France. No trials by fire, no public sermons, just signatures on paper. Then a scream no one heard. And then, in the summer of 1977, the final chapter. Hamida Jandoubi, a Tunisian immigrant convicted of kidnapping, torture, and murder. He was 28 years old. At 4:40 a.m. on September 10th, he was woken in his cell. His last request was a glass of rum. They gave it to him. He was calm, resigned. He was led down a narrow hallway, surrounded by guards, a priest at his side. The guillotine stood waiting, not under sunlight, not in a square, but in a tiled execution chamber. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. No witnesses but officials. No crowd, no echo. The blade dropped one last time. There was no applause, just a record in a book, a signature, and then silence. Hamida Jandoubi was the last person in Western Europe to be executed by beheading. He was also the last person ever executed in France. And the guillotine, the widow, the national razor, the whispering blade, was finally laid to rest. In 1981, France abolished the death penalty. The blade was dismantled, the wood was stored away. In a museum somewhere, you can still see it behind glass, dusty, quiet. But don't let its stillness fool you. It remembers, not with words, not with images, but with weight. The weight of history, of heads it has kissed, of eyes that saw it last, of blood that dried too fast to speak. And if you listen closely, not in daylight, not among crowds, but alone in the dark, you might still hear it. The sound of the rope pulling back, the creak of old wood, the sigh of a final breath, the whisper of a machine that never meant to become a god, but did. The guillotine was not evil. It did not hate. It did not judge. It simply obeyed. It was not a monster. We were. The guillotine no longer stands, but history doesn't forget, and neither should we. If the sound of its blade still echoes in your sleep, stay with us. There are darker stories waiting. Subscribe to Midnight Histories and let the past whisper you to sleep.